Hello and welcome. I'm George Wesley Cat, aka Neck Vermilion, and for a long time I've been wanting to do videos where I talked about media, and I decided I wanted to talk about music. So of course I go looking for different people to reference, different people that I could learn from, at least those who upload onto YouTube. And I find my way onto the YouTube channel Inside the Score. And the guy on Inside the Score has some interesting information worth listening to. But one of the things that stuck out to me is that the guy also has an interest in video game music, is curious of it. So I'm going to take a bit of a breather from doing my project there and talk about that. So that's basically what this video is. Now to start off, the guy talks about how he notices that video games do have this sort of a cinematic approach to it. And yes, that has been a thing that's been going on for quite a while now. Matter of fact, back in like the 1980s, there were games like Psycho Soldier, for example, in which case they tried to implement a lot of voice work and a song that has actual singing in it. So there was that. Although the technology at the time to have it work right it didn't sound as good in game as it does on cassette. But it was good enough. And along with Psycho Soldier, there was also Pac-Man, which every like five or so mazes, give or take, a little cartoon would play with the in-game characters doing whatever. Typically, the ghost chasing Pac-Man and Pac-Man outsmarting the ghost. So this is the kind of thing that started in the 80s. People were actually experimenting with it. And then come like 1990s, things actually really took a huge change as people tried to do more, such as, for example, when it comes to the whole concept of cutscenes. I mean, this was done a bit in the late 80s, but we really didn't see it really take off until the 90s, in which case there would be there would be like intro scenes with its own intro music playing. There would be ending sequences on top of the cutscenes. And eventually there was more singing as well. A lot more voice work. Sometimes it was so-so, but other times, as the 90s went on and technology got better for video games, we were getting full-on, full-blown soundtracks that were amazing and incredible. And some of which were very well done. Although, of course, being the huge CGI cinematic nerd that I am, well, I can't really call myself a nerd in that sense. But when it comes to those things like animated CGI and how seeing things progress and growing up with the technology, it was definitely a sight to behold. And the music that would be put to these scenes were also very incredible as well. They eventually, video game companies, the developers mostly, eventually perfected it. And then at some point we started getting like full-blown music videos for a lot of games. And there were some games where it's just, you have this huge music video or this whole sequence to describe how things happen as an intro. You play the game through, and then came the ending, in which case you'd have a mini movie playing at the end of the game, full-on staff roll sequence with the music playing, and a lot of times it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. Definitely a huge step up from the early games where you just had the usual congratulations. And yeah, the misspellings were horrible in the past when it came to the games. On a side note, games also became more like interactive stories throughout the 90s. You still have the usual stuff that you'd expect of the arcade scene, especially when fighting games started getting really huge. Fighting games and racing games, but those two also got their own fair share of music that complement them, like the best of the best of fighting games with the soundtrack. A lot of it feels like those action scenes you see in film or in anime and the like, where characters are just fighting, dodging, and weaving, punches and kicks, and even the more supernatural oriented stuff with like fireballs and beams all over the place. All while the music playing that's like works with the action, high intensity. And sometimes it's not even something that's for the atmosphere. Sometimes it's just an upbeat sort of atmospheric thing, more based on the surroundings than the characters themselves. And that was another thing that made everything great when it came to the music in video games. In which case, you'd have the whole thing of different characters having their own respective theme songs that in turn reflect how the character are, their like what the play style would be for the characters and the like. Another thing inside the score pointed out was the whole thing of adaptive music. And while what is said does apply to role-playing games and adventure games, and I'll get to that in a minute, this was also seen a bit in other genres as well, such as going back to fighting games. There's Street Fighter games, for example. You had the music that would play based on the characters, like you had this one jungle man monster kind of character named Blanca, and like you have this sort of jungle theme playing for the stage that's meant for him, and then you had like a Balrog who's more like a Vegas showman boxer sort of thing, but he also plays dirty when fighting in the street. And so you have a more Vegas oriented sort of music playing there. But not only do you have that, but you also have where like if the timer's going low or the characters are low at health, and then the music just speeds up. So that sort of thing does happen. And it's also the same thing when it comes to role-playing games as well. Just as a guy on Inside the Score was saying about adaptive music, you have the whole thing of moving through the field, and then when there's an enemy that's encountered, battle music plays when encountering them, and that is a thing. And that is something that does happen when it comes mostly with role-playing games. Sometimes it works fantastic and well. Other times it's kind of iffy, but overall it does bring about a great experience to the game. But yeah, what I mean by it can be iffy depends on how the game works and the kind of music that's put into it. Most of the Final Fantasy games do this right, in which case it has the active time battle system. So, well, let me explain things. Like when it comes to role-playing games, oftentimes you're controlling a team. Sometimes it's a tactics-oriented one where you're moving characters across a board, putting them into position such. Other times you're just deciding what attacks they'll do, what items they'll use, and the like. What kind of spells to cast for magic-oriented places, and that sort of thing. Or magic-oriented characters, rather. And what I mean by it doesn't always work is that you'll have like the music will start building up while the character's mid-attack, and then trying to make decisions in the menu, and the music's at its climax. So there are weird things like that. But then there's games like a lot of the Final Fantasy games, in which case you have a sort of what's called active time battle system, in which case after a certain amount of time the the enemy will attack, and if the enemy has like an ultra powerful move at a certain time, after the time passes, then that enemy will use that ultra powerful move. And especially when it comes to like the boss battles that happen, this can be intense, incredible, and very well done. And so you'll see there's a lot of instances where it's like, okay, you have like the atmospheric stuff, and then you have the build up and whatnot while you're attacking, and then at the climax of the song, suddenly whatever big bad you're fighting gets ready this huge massive attack and just wails on you. Maybe it's like a volley of missiles, maybe it's like using magic to bring about a meteor from the sky, crazy stuff like that. And when it's done like that, it's definitely quite the spectacle to see. So things like that do happen as well, which is an interesting approach and actually make things work so well. At least how I see it. So there's that as well. Likewise, there's also what's called the shoot 'em up genre, or shmup for short. Basically, flying planes, using this. It's typically like a jet fighter, or some character with superpowers who, because of their superpowers, they're able to fly through the sky. They're like doing eye beams or energy blasts out of the hands and that sort of thing. And so you have the character or they're in the giant robot that's just flying forward and shooting stuff. And so when it comes to the shooters, that takes a interesting approach as well. That does work when it comes to the soundtrack. So like you'll be flying and okay, good example is one of my favorites, which is Einhander. Einhander is one of my favorites. Like you have this techno that you expect from a cyberpunk sort of setting. I guess you could refer to like something like Blade Runner or Shadowrun. So techno music in that sense is playing. You're flying through, and the music shifts, and it shifts with with the scenery that you're flying past, and sometimes even shifting based on what kind of enemy you're fighting, which can be it robots underneath the city or machine gun mounts on top of a train, depending on what you're going after at that point in the game Einhander. So there's that as well. There's a lot that can be said really when it comes to video game music, but a lot of what can apply to one game may not really apply to another, so it gets tricky. I want to say more, but I think that I'm going to wind up stretching this to like at least a half hour to get even a small fragment said that I would like to say. So that is what I had to say on the subject. I hope my rambling isn't too messy. I hope I'm understood. On the flip, one thing I do want to point out, I did build up a playlist of various soundtracks. Some parts of the playlist do actually include the music videos, like I said, that would play at the intro of a video game. And then there's also some instances such as from Tales of the Rays, the song New Wall. I just went with the music video by the actual band rather than the intro sequence, because for some reason I can't put the intro sequence into the playlist. So if you're curious of what's out there, I've assembled a playlist for that. So that's what I had to say. I am George Rusty Cat, aka Neck Vermilion. I thank you for watching, and hopefully I'm not too confusing with this video.